My name's KRISTI Hawthorne. I'm the president of the Oceanside Historical Society. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for your attention. And I really want to thank Wayne Donaldson, again, for coming down, doing a second presentation here for the Oceanside Historical Society and the Oceanside Public Library. And we're really honored to have him, and I know that you're excited to hear what he has to say and talk about our Irving Gill buildings. I also want to introduce my board. We've got John Daly. John, can you wave everybody? We've got Shelley Grishon. We've got Ronna Lee Ellsbury. Can you wave, Ronnie? And Janice Ulmer. So without further ado, then I'm going to introduce Jenna Lees with the Oceanside Public Library.
So thank you, KRISTI, and thank you for the Historical Society. I'm really excited about this partnership that we have with the Historical Society as the library, because you guys bring so many great programs to us that we wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to have. So thank you, KRISTI, and thank you to the board with the Historical Society. And I also want to thank the Friends of the Oceanside Public Library, because they make programs like this possible for the library to have. I am honored to present Milford Wayne Donaldson. I was just talking to him a minute ago, and he's celebrating his 40th year as an architect this year. So that's pretty amazing. 40 years in the same profession is really commendable. In the past, he was the California State Historic Preservation Officer, and he's currently the chairman on the Advisory for Council of Historic Preservation for the United States. So it's amazing that he's here to talk to us. I'm not exaggerating when I say he's an expert on Irving Gill. He's from Oceanside. So I think that maybe it was a little thing in the back of his brain that made him study architecture. I made that up. I didn't ask him about it, but I think that that's probably the case. And I'm super, super honored that he's presenting this history talk on Irving Gill. So here he is.
Well, thank you so much. At the end of this, I would like to introduce Paul, who's out there. He has an original architectural stamp from Irving Gill that he found, and I thought he could talk a little bit about it, maybe a few sentences on it. I thought this lecture today would be a little bit different than a lot of lectures on Irving Gill, where it focuses heavily on the architecture and not so much on the art and poetry of Irving Gill. So I had put together a show a couple of years ago in talking about the poetry, but it was much longer than this, and I wanted to also spend some time talking about Oceanside as well and showing you some of his comments. This is him in about 1890. So one of his more famous quotes is, "Any deviation from simplicity results in a loss of dignity." I think this is very poetic when you consider to think that a lot of the stuff that we do seems to be overly emphasized. Next. This is in the late 1880s. This is the École des Beaux-Arts, which was sort of the foundation where architects would then study during this time. And besides being taught in just simple architecture, mostly by copying other really good examples of what they considered to be good architecture, they also got into, and it was divided into several sections, and one was the Academy of Painting and Sculpture, besides the Academy of Architecture. So you were trained not only as an architect, but as a painter, as a sculptor, to really look at the arts in the way that you would think that most architects would look at it, rather than from a standard engineering point. This is sort of a very small printing of Louis Sullivan's quote, but you often hear the thing when you're talking about architecture is that form ever follows function. Or we just simply say in the architectural world, form follows function, which means that whatever the form of that particular item is, whether it's in nature, or whether it's metaphysical, or whether it's even from the head or the heart, whatever that form is really then explains to you or tells you what's behind it. And you can see that Louis, besides being an incredible architect from 1856 to 1924, he really kind of came up with the concept of showing the structure of the building so that you could actually see the load bearing on this. So when you folks see some bricks glued to something that looks really weird, that's not really a form follows a function, because the brick isn't becoming a brick at that point. Next. So as Sullivan was getting ready for the 1883 World's Columbia Exposition, this was celebrating Christopher Columbus' 400th anniversary in Chicago. Gill was also there, next. And the exhibit that was there from California was unique because it was a huge structure, and you can see that it had a Moorish dome, which we'll revisit later in Gill's architecture. The building was very large, over 130 feet tall, and it was kind of the concept that we'll see later on of the Spanish colonial architecture, which is Nicaragua, Honduras, and other areas down south of Mexico on this. However, at the same time, in our own backyard, as you can see from Mission San Luis Rey, our missions were in terrible state of affairs. Being abandoned in 1823 by the Spanish, they fell into disregards. Many of the ranchos came and scarfed materials, like Rancho Guajome, which is out here, and capturing the beams and a lot of the pavers and the tile work from Mission San Luis Rey. Mission San Diego, they're all like this, standing abandoned. It's hard to even believe that this looks like Mission San Diego. However, during this period, there was also a big push in Southern California to present this romantic era of the dawns and the parties and the romance of the Spanish. So you had these postcards coming out that kind of made it look like Mission San Diego was in really good state of affairs, but in fact it really wasn't. And of course these were all hand painted, so they made them look good. Another architect that came into being at this time, very common, you probably heard this over and over again, less is more, meaning that without the ornamentation and all the gobbledygook and stuff, is that the architecture really helps define what the vocabulary is that you're trying to get across in terms of the design. Again, one of the most famous buildings probably is the Barcelona Pavilion for 1929 International Exposition in Spain. Also, Gill was influenced by several artists. One was Schiller, who is one of the central figures at this time in the American modernist art. From Philadelphia, his compositions were very geometric and influenced by Cubism, including a lot of his photography that he did of cityscapes. And you can kind of see a lot of Gill influence in Schiller's comment here. Next. So the Klein House, which was a Hebard and Gill. Hebard then partnershiped with Gill in the earlier years, and he studied under him, but you can really see some of the earlier influences that Gill had with the Klein House. This was 1897 to 98. Now remember, this is sort of the high period of the Victorian period, when you compare Victorian homes to what is happening on the scene here. And of course, Frank Lloyd Wright, we always have to get a quote from Frank Lloyd Wright. The mother of art is architecture. Without an architecture of our own, we'll have no soul of our own civilization. He was adamantly opposed to any of the revival periods that we were coming up with during the time, including a lot of the more federal buildings and things that were Greek revivals, and he was just adamantly opposed. He says, that is not our architecture, that is architecture from the past. We need to invent our own. So one of his more famous ones, completely restored. The National Trust for Historic Preservation had their national conference there last year, which, by the way, they're having it this year in San Francisco, so you're all invited, and they did a wonderful thing. But notice how he was actually following a lot of another French architect in terms of concrete structural systems and pierced terracotta packed with concrete. So he was already, Frank was already copying Antoine Baudou's architecture at this time. And then Irving Gill at the Rear Center, teaching a class in architectural drawing in San Diego at the YMCA in 1906. I actually have a stool from this office, and I gave it to Save Our Heritage organization. Richard Requa, who I have in the inset, who is in the lighter jacket in the front there, he's about 26 years old at this time. Next. And Gill is also still being influenced by a lot of the earlier craftsman type of architecture, the Marston House, 1904 to 5, when he was again with Hebard. But I want to point out the gardens and the color. A lot of times we don't appreciate some of the landscaping that is tied to the architecture and really integral with that. And Vaughn Marie May is landscape architect sitting behind Paul there, so I'm not going to get into her turf, but a lot of times we don't respect it like we should. So this was a prototype workers' college in 1906. I had a chance to buy this house. It's in Mission Hills. Very, very small, probably less than 800 square feet. But they wanted $500,000 for it at that time. And that was like over $500 a square foot when you could buy a regular house for $50 a square foot. So I thought, well, that's ridiculous. Now I wish I had done it. But very simple. He was also experimenting with materials at this time. I don't think he was a germophobic, but he didn't like any kind of surfaces that caught dust. So everything was basically sheared. In a lot of his homes, he had in-house vacuums at that time, which you have in modern homes where you just take the hose and plug it in the wall. So he was really unique about this. Next. The Episcopal Church, 1907, is now St. James by the Sea. It's interesting at this time, in 1907, to find a biplane, probably just wedged in there. I doubt if it was flying over and they took a picture of it. But at this time, San Diego was becoming a modern city, and later on became, of course, known as the air capital of the world because of a lot of the earlier inventions that we had here in San Diego. So one of his unique homes, the Bailey Weekend House. Bailey was a buildings material supplier in San Diego. And it's right at the cove in San Diego. But you'll notice now you're starting to see some departure from the Craftsman period, although you still see some Craftsman staying. You still see some outriggers on the roof. You still see some of the windows with part of the wood trimming. You'll see some introductions now of some of the curved arches, which you did not find in Craftsman at this time. So you're starting to see now some introductions that's a little bit unique. Even the roof now is starting to get flat rather than the typical Craftsman pitch roof. Next. But this is a view of the cove from the living room of the Bailey house. And when I took this, it was unique because of the colors. And you don't get the colors unless the sun's moving. But if you can imagine part of the moss and everything else, you get these wonderful dancing colors that I'm sure that when Gill was doing this house, he was looking at this, and besides the white water in the ocean, it's this wonderful mosaic of colors that was impressive to him. Funny quote from Jack the Dripper here, Jackson Pollock. But again, he grew up in Arizona and in Chico, California. A lot of people think he's from the East, but he's not. He also experienced, much like Gill did, going on in his later years, but early on, Pollock experienced Native American culture on surveying trips with his father and everything else. And I think that's probably part of his earlier memories that he then started to develop more in a regional style, which I think was greatly influenced Gill at this time to look more on a regional scale now, instead of looking at a lot of the stuff on a national things where we're doing reproduction architecture. And Gill had a wonderful hand. The Melville Clobber House, which has really kind of set Soho on the map to a large degree. It was demolished. This is his rendering from 1907. And you'll notice his colors now are coming in here. This is not what you would traditionally find an architect presenting to a client. This is actually, looks like a watercolor that you would hang up on the wall. And he was trying then to search and reach through his brush to kind of capture this regional feeling. Again, a detail from it. Notice the yellow sky. One thing about this region is we have yellow skies. You know, we have blue skies too, but I mean, we have yellow skies when you really look at this wonderful impressionistic thing that we have. Next. And even the steps down below, his color overlaps are done not only with the color, but also with the same brush. All right, John Muir, I know that he was greatly influenced, at least Thomas Hines thinks so, on looking at what part of the wilderness was presented in the architecture, because at this time, at least down in San Diego area, it looked like Camp Pendleton. You didn't have the trees, wood was a scarcity, especially during the earlier days of the development of California in the 1850s and 60s. Everything was imported and brought down from San Francisco, the wood and everything else in order to build stuff. So the Allen House Again, 1907 in Bonita, again, Gill and Mead. But notice the simplicity now. This, to me, I think, is one of his best pieces of work. And look at how simple this is. And then going back to John Muir, this is the view that you got off of part of the back steps. Now, this is incredible because we don't get these views anymore. Most of our views, if you want views and you're talking about real estate and everything else, it's the Pacific Ocean. But the views to the mountains and this golden hue that we had was so precious during that day. I wish it was in color, but it's not. Next. And Pablo Picasso, of course, starting real cubism at this time. I love this quote from him. It's just another way of keeping a diary. I was thinking maybe architects do that. You know, drawings are just another way of keeping a diary. And I think they are to a certain degree if you do hand drafting. But I think once you get into CAD, then who knows, huh? All right. Again, most of you know Picasso. He was really an innovator. But Gill was also influenced by Paul Cézanne and Henri Bergson and all of this, and part also of archaic and tribal art on this. One of his painters was Twachtman. This is Hemlock Pool in Autumn in 1894. Notice that it's now starting to get more of the impressionistic painters than this. In other words, getting the feeling across rather than the detail, so that you're setting the mood when you're looking at it rather than trying to examine every little piece and part of it. And it's very simple. I mean, it looks like it's busy, but it's extremely simple because where does your focus go? It goes towards the pool because it is surrounded by a complementary color of its oranges and yellows. Next. So Gill tried this with his clients. And he wanted to try to invoke this feeling, not only the yellow sky, but also this impressionistic feeling. This is the Children's Homes Association dormitory in 1908, San Diego. And notice now he's starting to incorporate the good old hanging vines everywhere. You know, let it drip down the house, let it grow up the side, because now we're not just talking about the simplicity of a Miesian type of architecture, a Stark architecture. He's now getting regionalized. In other words, he's looking at the region and what actually grows here. One of the nice things about this whole region, you stick something